Okay, yeah, no. All right, so I guess I'll get started. Hopefully your water bomb. Good evening, everyone. The Open Table of Christ United Methodist Church, which has services every Sunday at 10 a.m., would like to welcome you to the lecture titled American Irony, Religious Freedom and Slavery in Colonial Rhode Island, Honoring African Heritage in Rhode Island and Beyond, by Keith Stokes. If someone were to do a quick internet search of Keith Stokes, you'll realize he's achieved various academic and professional accolades, one which includes a vice presidency of the 1696 Heritage Group. Unless I'm mistaken, I believe the mission of the 1696 Heritage Group, or one of its missions, is helping persons and institutions of color increase their knowledge and access to the light of truth and their unique American heritage. Personally speaking, I believe uniqueness is a key phrase in that mission statement. I've been a lifelong Rhode Islander. Currently, Rhode Island is seen as a progressive state whose politics, in many of our lifetimes, exist on the Democratic side of American politics. Given these political proclivities, Rhode Island also shares a history that is not often discussed. A history that it may not be so proud of, but nevertheless did benefit from economically. Even today, if you walk through some public parks and schools, children of color are asked to revere names of individuals that 300 or more years ago would have viewed them as possessions. The mission of the Open Table of Christ is to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. Regardless of religious affiliations, if any at all, I believe Mr. Stokes will exemplify those attributes through this lecture. So again, I'd like to welcome Mr. Keith Stokes to the space.
Thank you, and it's wonderful to be here in this heat. But I'm actually here representing the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society. The Rhode Island Black Heritage Society, if you don't know, is one of the oldest continually operating Black Heritage Societies in the country. We'll be having next year our 50th anniversary. It also has one of the largest collection from colonial era to present day of primary, secondary documents, pamphlets, artifacts, furniture, and all assortment of artifacts going back to close to 3,000 linear feet. In fact, we're in a process of digitizing our collections because many of our collections today, I don't think this is on yet. I don't think the microphone's on yet. No.
I don't think it is either.
There's a button on the side.
Right now.
There we go.
Okay.
So give me a second. But the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society, our collections today have been made available to historical institutions around not only the country, but the world. And we've also worked with scholars across the African diaspora. And I've had the honor to be the historian for a number of years for the society. I've also been the Rhode Island advisor for the National Trust for Historic Preservation. So I've had access and I've worked with not only African heritage institutions across the country, but I've gone across the diaspora from Ghana to Barbados to Jamaica to Curacao to Bahamas. My running joke is that I've been to all of those places several times over the last 2 decades, never been on a beach. Always in archives and stacks or in the urban centers. So maybe someday I'll get to be on the beach in Ghana, but not yet. That's it. So this particular presentation, we're going to present about 400 years of history in about 45 minutes. So I apologize if I rush through that. We are going to leave for the audience a copy of this presentation, and then I've also talked to Dwayne and others. We've compiled with the Historical Society and the work a few years ago in Providence for reparations. We now have an over 700 bibliography source, primary, secondary sources, research papers, original articles. We're quite excited about this, and this bibliography has helped shape not only this presentation, but it's shaping many of the historical programs that we're now doing. In this particular presentation, American Irony, we're going to introduce you to the very founding periods of what is today recognized as Rhode Island, the colony of Rhode Island Providence plantations at that time. And we'll talk about the irony of the men and women that arrived here for the sole purpose, as persecuted religious minorities, to simply find a space and a place where they could worship without looking over their shoulder, and not having a king or queen in the old world or royal governors in the new world dictate how they should worship or not. Almost simultaneously, as they achieved this, what today we call the lively experiment, they all actively entered and prospered and dominated for over 150 years, what today we recognize as the transatlantic slave trade. So when we talk about slavery in the early Americas, I'm talking about British North America. So we're talking about the original 13 colonies that are part of British North America. We're not talking about the entire Western Hemisphere. But what we have done over the last several years, and I led a research team, we now have for the first time a database of all documented slave voyages that began and were owned and operated by Rhode Island merchants. And we'll talk about that a few minutes later. There are certainly many, many more, but what we have found, what we've documented compared to other sources, Rhode Island, as a colony in British North America, was the most active, prosperous slave trading center across the Western Hemisphere. Newport, my community, far dominated any other colonial city at that time. It far dominated anything in Rhode Island, Boston, Philadelphia, Charleston, South Carolina. It's Newport, and we have the documents around that. So it's important to recognize that we have such pride, and in fact, this first slide, we have such pride in what we call our lively experiment. When Roger Williams here in Providence, Ann Hutchinson, William Connington, John Clark, on what today we recognize as Aquidneck Island, Portsmouth, Middletown, and Newport, they brought to this colony, and establishing this colony, this lively experiment, an experiment where they believed we are going to organize and charter an English colony, but it will not have a requirement that its subjects would have to worship based upon a king or a queen, King Charles II at the time in England, or a royal governor in the newly established colony. So what happened very early on, literally within the first 10 years of the establishment of this colony, many of the most horrifically persecuted religious minorities at that time, today we recognize as Quakers, early Sephardic Jews arriving from the Iberian Peninsula as they were cast out dating back to the 15th century in the Spanish Inquisition. They're all getting words, particularly from West Indian settlements. There's this place called Rhode Island, and I can actually go and prosper. I can worship freely and not look over my shoulder. Or, in the worst circumstances, be physically persecuted with violence and death. So Rhode Island became this very neat place that the Connecticut colony called us Rogues Island. You probably have heard that term, Rogues Island. It has nothing to do with slavery or rum or piracy. It's Rogues Island because we're this only early colony in England that would accept anyone and everyone, all the heretics and such. So the general feeling was, it's the rogues that are coming to Rhode Island to settle. Not the escaping, fleeing Catholics and Quakers, not the Sephardic Jews, not this new Baptist religion that's fomenting here in the Americas, but it's rogues and heretics. And that's how we were looked upon by our neighbors in Massachusetts and Connecticut. And what's important is that the founding men and women, and Ann Hutchinson deserves a significant amount of credit as part of the founding leadership, is that they believe very strongly that this will be the place where we can worship freely. In fact, Roger Williams, during his entire lifetime in Providence, never supported, never built, and never worshipped in a Baptist meeting house. He didn't believe that. If you read his writings very carefully, Williams would consistently say, once you start to build buildings and have organized religious leaders, you're separating man, meaning all, from God. So he believed very fervently that we should all share this religion, we should all share in leading our prayer meetings, and not have a fixed physical facilities. When we start building facilities, we're building barriers. And in fact, it's Newport where the very first structured place of Baptist worship is built. And then over the years, a second is built. And today, it's located on Spring Street, and it's called the John Clark Memorial Church. It's the third building. And it wouldn't be until the Colonial Rhode, immediately after the American Revolution, that our First Baptist Church in Providence that we have. So the First Baptist congregation, through the vision of Williams, is Providence, but the physical structures are starting in Newport. But what's most important to recognize is we become this beacon of attracting all the people who have been persecuted By 1758, Quakers are now establishing themselves in Rhode Island. In fact, Rhode Island is a much larger Quaker settlement well before William Penn even arrives and establishes Pennsylvania and Philadelphia. So when you think of the early Quaker tradition, even the physical spaces, it has as much of a Rhode Island presence as it does in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. That is why in Newport, the oldest place of worship in Rhode Island is the Quaker Meeting House dating back to 1699. In fact, when the Quakers first completed it, they had a large cupola, they had large arcing windows. Everyone said, stop, 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 this is getting a little bit over the top. Take the cupola down, bring the windows down, let's be more pious. Roger Williams was so upset that Quakers were settling in. Even though Williams believed in expression of religious freedom, he was concerned that Quakers still seemed like a cult. He was a little concerned with that. He rode all the way down in a boat down Narragansett Bay so he could debate George Fox and the Quakers who established themselves at Newport at that time. But what we do know is that by the following year, 1658, Sephardic Jews arrived, which is a part of my family ancestry in Newport, who would later become the congregation to establish Turtle Synagogue over the next century. And these Jews that arrived were literally persecuted from Spain, and they escaped with Dutch and landed in Dutch settlements such as Curacao and Barbados, in a place called New Amsterdam before it became New York. And in each and every case, they didn't prosper there. They didn't feel comfortable. They were restricted being fully engaged residents and inhabitants simply because they were Jews. So they land in Newport. And in fact, one of the most precious documents that we have in Newport is a part of Turtle Synagogue. In 1684, those Jews petitioned the Rhode Island General Assembly and said, look, we're not Christians, we're Israelites, can we stay? And the response was, yes, pay your taxes, be good as citizens, and you can stay. That simple statement was resounding because it meant by statute, by legislative act, we are not going to dismiss any person based upon religion, and certainly minority religion. I can't tell you how exciting that was at that time. I mean, if you were a Quaker or a Jew, there were very few places you could be. And you came here. You came to Rhode Island. You were prospering in early Newport, in Providence. And as the colony expanded, they expanded. And one of the things that's important in recognizing that, as I tried to hint on, some of the earliest historic physical buildings that represent these early congregations are largely clustered here in Rhode Island. In many cases, the percentage of early religious structures as a part of Rhode Island landscape is as high and as meaningful as any other place in America. I mean, I'm always proud to say this. Being a Newporter, my kids are 10th generation Newporters. And I have a granddaughter now, brand new granddaughter, so she's 11th generation, but she was born at home in infant, so we got to get her passed to make sure she's recognized in Newport. But one of the things we're most proud of is that when you take Newport, Bristol, and Providence together, we have more colonial era existing historic structures than anywhere in America. The smallest state. And these structures represent the early men and women and families who had arrived here, persecuted because of religious beliefs, would later build a life for themselves and opportunities as such. And in fact, just to give you a sense of why this is important, today everyone is debating the issues of diversity and inclusion. It's almost being assaulted. It's weaponized. But in fact, one of the most important aspects of diversity is because it brings in not only diversity of people, but it brings diverse thought, diverse commerce, diverse access to markets. Quakers were not allowed to go anywhere, so they prospered here. What did they bring with them? There's some of the earliest and finest furniture makers and craftsmen at that time. Sephardic Jews are not allowed to go anywhere. They're not entertained to arrive. They come here and they start establishing trade and opportunities unlike anywhere else. In fact, the golden age of our maritime economy by the mid-18th century is driven by these same families who had arrived several generations before and were not allowed into Massachusetts colony, Connecticut colony, Maryland colony, Virginia colony, but they came here and they brought not only their religious freedom and worship opportunities, they brought their commerce and their trade, and most importantly, built almost immediately the economy of this colony. But it's what this economy is built on we'll talk about in a few minutes, because it's very centered on a maritime trade, a transatlantic maritime trade, centered around the trade of men, women, and children of the African continent. But I just want to point out, before I leave this, and being a Newport, I love to do this in Newport, particularly with some of the visitors and tourists. When Newport was being laid out, unlike any colonial community at that time, John Clark, who literally is the person that travels to England, the King Charles II court, to negotiate the charter, which he brings back, and it's authorized by July 2nd, 1663. John Clark believed very strongly, as an early Baptist minister, that, like Williams, we can't have any one religion dominating the landscape. And if you ever go to a colonial New England town, and you go to their town center, or parade grounds, you almost always see at the top of the parade grounds a meeting house or a church. And in many cases, it represents the dominating religion or the dominating congregation of that time, the 18th and 19th century. And many times, New England is congregational, or it's Anglican. And then at the bottom, you might see a meeting house or a counting house. And then all the leading families live around that. Newport is one of the few, if only, colonial communities where our town center, which is today Washington Square, it is not a church at the top or leading the square, not an Anglican Trinity Church, my parish, not the Quaker Meeting House, not the Congregational churches, there were 3, not the Baptist churches, there were 2. It's the Colonials, our state capitol building, which is the 4th oldest existing in the country. What's most important is John Clark and the early residents wanted to make sure that the physical spacing, the physical feeling of this community would not allow any one congregation to dominate the other. And in fact, if you see in these slides here, all of our existing meeting houses, including the synagogue built during that colonial era, are all in a semicircle, all around Washington Square. And that's fun for me, because if you ever come to Newport, how many have come and saw Queen Anne Square? Queen Anne Square is right downtown. My church, Trinity Anglican, sits at the top. There's a beautiful green, the Thames Street, the waterfront. We created that in 1976 during the bicentennial to create a town center, because we didn't have it. And the Queen Mother, Queen Elizabeth, was arriving, and we wanted to make sure that she felt that she was welcome. And we named it Queen Anne Square after Queen Anne, and it looked like this beautiful green and town center with the church at the top. It's all fabricated. We do it for visitors. Today, I'm always marveling when I'm walking by them, visitors are taking a picture there and saying, oh, look, I'm in the Colonial Newport, the Colonial Town Center. No, we made it up. It never would have existed. So it's important to recognize that the physical space, even to this day, still represents that lively experiment, that separation of church and state, and the belief that all men and women and families have a right to worship freely, and that government shouldn't intercede on that right. And also, not have any worship at all. It's important to recognize that. It's not only the freedom to worship, but the freedom not to worship. Just be a good citizen, pay your taxes, and live your life. But it's also important to recognize that during this settlement period, this live experiment period, as Williams is arriving for the Massachusetts Bay Colony, they're not arriving to a blank slate. And in fact, one of the most extraordinary events of that time, of that founding period, it begins in a 3-year period of time, which today we recognize as the Great Dying. Between about 1616 and 1619, before, as we know, the Pilgrims land and established themselves, Massachusetts Bay Colony, that 3-year period, you're beginning to see European explorers going up and down the Atlantic seaboard, and particularly here in the New England seaboard. And as they're interacting with indigenous people who are the coastal families that are living from Cape Cod to Maine, what's going on in that really late 16th and into the 17th century? What's going on in Europe? Pestilence, disease. Why are Europeans looking to escape England, France, Spain, Italy? Disease, pestilence. So unwittingly, as they arrive in their ships with rats and farm animals that have fleas, they bring with them pestilence. During that 3-year period between 1616 and 1619, we talk about COVID, how we survived COVID. Nearly 90% of the indigenous people that had first contact in the coastal areas died of disease within that 3-year period. We were uncovering horrific but important primary documents at that time where ship captains who were just transporting goods and products, just exploring. I was here a year ago, I came back, everything's gone. Thousands of men, women, and families living, prospering on the waterfront, gone. So it's important to recognize that during that early colonization period, the settlement period, it's disease that sets the stage for widespread European colonization. And I'm using the term colonization because that's their term. We're not called the territories of New England. We're not called the collective of New England. We're the colony. They were colonizing. And in fact, when we begin to read primary documents from religious leaders of that time in Massachusetts and Rhode Island colonies, their interpretation of this great plague, this great dying, is that it's God's hand. God's hand has wiped away the pagan infidels and opened the land of milk and honey for us to prosper, to utilize, to prosper, and expand our belief in the light which is Jesus Christ for Christianity. In fact, they call themselves not New Englanders, they call themselves English Israel. We are like the Jews of the Old Testament. The Jews, by the hand of God, are brought out of slavery from Egypt and brought to the land of milk and honey so they can prosper as Jews, as the chosen people. We are the chosen people to colonize, settle, and prosper in the Americas. So it's important to recognize that the very founding period, which begins with this religious fervor, solidifies in the mind of the men and women and the families of that time, the clergy. And again, this is 17th century. We can't take modern day social, political, intellectual, and impose it upon men, women, and families and institutions that were so long ago. They didn't have access to our way of understanding science, interacting with people, humanity. They didn't. But we have to understand at the time that they lived, they absolutely believed that their manifest destiny was to own, possess, and prosper in this new colony as colonizers. And as that was unfolding, it's important to recognize that that exact same time this colony is being founded, and it's King Charles II that provides a charter to establish the colony of Rhode Island. He marries well and establishes a charter to establish an English version of a trans and trade company. And it's this English trade company is given an exclusive patent to now explore and trade along the West African coast. So at the same time this colony is being established, a charter is established to allow English merchants to compete with Portuguese, who have already for over 100 years have been exploring from North Africa down the coast into what is today West Africa. We're now going to compete with them, and we want to make sure that English trade, English economy is now looking at these potential spoils of what is today recognized as West Africa. And one of the great ironies with that, and I'll have several very important ironies tied to that, is Roger Williams. It is absolutely essential that we recognize the contribution of Roger Williams, his liberty of conscience, his belief in freedom and separation of church and state. But we also have to recognize he's a 17th century person, greatly influenced by the confines of the religion that he understands it and the life that he lives within. Roger Williams is the first European to interact with many of the indigenous people who were away from the coast, such as the Narragansetts, and begin to learn their language and begin to literally understand them, appreciate them, support them. It is Roger Williams that negotiates peacefully the acquisition of what becomes Providence. So we can disagree today that it was, a steal and low cost and unfair, but the point was it was a negotiated process. And then later, he negotiates with Maitanomo, Tammany, who were the sachems and chiefs at that time, for William Connington to take over what is today Aquidneck Island. But in any case, Roger Williams opens the door for more European colonizers to arrive. And for the indigenous people, initially they believed there's trade opportunities, there's learning opportunities, there's just a few of them, we can cohabitate this land. They also believed, and this is where the real difference between indigenous beliefs would run counter to European beliefs. Remember what I said, the Europeans arrived here, and we have a God-driven manifest destiny to not only live and prosper in this land, but to own the land, control the land, work the land. And they would introduce cattle and farm animals to graze in the land. They'd introduce fencing to control who owned what. And for the indigenous people, you don't own land. You don't own animals. If we need animals for subsistence, we take them and we thank them. If we need land, either access to the water, to have access to gathering food. Then we have access and then we move on, but we don't own it. So almost immediately as colonizers expand and grow, and the surviving indigenous people are getting backed away from the coast, the waterfront property, kind of like today, aren't we all getting pushed away from waterfront property? You begin to have tensions. And it's the Pequots in the first part of the 17th century that fight back. You have a devastating set of Pequot Wars, where the Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut colonies come together with backing of the Narragansetts to defeat the Pequots. And those Pequot men who had survived the battle were shipped off to be enslaved in the English-controlled West Indies. And by the end of the 17th century, you begin to have what we recognize as the King Philip's War. And in the King Philip's War, all leading and all built around indigenous people who had lived here for tens of thousands of years, who had sovereign personal rights to own the land that they've lived upon and prosper, are now being pushed to the brink. And they fight back. That devastating war, by the conclusion of the war, the Great Swamp Fight, which is really a Great Swamp Massacre, because the indigenous Narragansett men, women, and families were mostly killed, were elderly and children and women who were hidden away from the braves. But by the end of that war, Roger Williams, Thomas Olney, and a number of the leaders of Providence come together to discuss, we cannot have another devastating war. Too much loss of life, property. It will stifle our manifest destiny to continue to prosper in this colony. So we must find a solution. And they came together and formed a committee, and every surviving indigenous man over the age of 10 was sold off into slavery. And since Rhode Island was not accepting slavery at that time, they made the determination to send them to the West Indies. In fact, many of the surviving men landed in places like Barbados and Bermuda. I was in Barbados years ago and actually found descendants connected to that. So by the end of the 17th century, the end of the King Philip's War, the combination of famine, war, enslavement, indigenous people are not wiped out, but they're placed in such small numbers under such tight control, they don't pose that threat to the manifest destiny of the colonizers of Rhode Island. And this would play out in Massachusetts, Connecticut. And we talk about the great migration of indigenous people in the 19th century, when we moved them in the antebellum area from the American South westward in the Trail of Tears. But the Trail of Tears originated here, sending surviving indigenous men south to the West Indies. So it's important that we understand this history. This is factual history. This is how our colony was established. And it's not anything that's seen in black or white or good or bad. It's gray. It's always shades of gray. People, men, women, families, institutions were making decisions that they believed at the time would be to the best interest of themselves, their religion, their economy, and their community. So I want to set the stage of what it now looks like by the end of the 17th century. Indigenous people are so small, they're having little or no impact of the manifest destiny of growth. The colonizers now are taking large swaths of land. It's an agricultural-based economy fed by a maritime trade economy. And we need a workforce. We need a workforce to work on these farms, to work on these waterfronts. Where will this workforce come? It's enslaved African that become the feeder. By the mid part of the 17th century, enslaved Africans are coming from Massachusetts, Connecticut colony, and then by the end of the 17th century, it is Newport that decides, let's step our toe in the water in the transatlantic trade. Because we need so many more workers and servants. In fact, if you look at the records at that time, you'll never see the term slave. It's servant. We're so genteel here in New England. But let me be clear, when the term servant is applied in the 18th and 17th century, it's an enslaved African. So by the end of the 17th century and beginning of the 18th century, you begin to see this transformative period across the Western Hemisphere, but particularly in Rhode Island, where everyone is now doing more than putting a toe in the water. They're all actively engaged in being involved in this transatlantic slave trade. And in fact, this slave trade is so extensive. We've looked at records, primary source records worldwide, and what we're now comfortable in saying that over a 350-year period, from about 1780 onward, at least 12 million African men, women, and children were taken from the African continent, because it's a continent, not a country, and brought via what is called the Middle Passage, largely to the West Indies and South America, and then eventually some back to British North America. We know that. What we also know, which becomes very important, is that Rhode Island dominated that trade. Remember, we're part of British North America. We're a British colony. We're not Spanish, Dutch, Portuguese, French. We're British. So logically thinking, we're trading with other British colonies. What are the British settlements and colonies on the West African coast? What are the British colonies in the West Indies? So what today we recognize as the transatlantic trade or the triangular trade from Rhode Island or New England to West Africa, and then from West Africa through the Middle Passage to the West Indies, and then back up to New England. In the case of West Africa, most of the Rhode Island, most of the New England merchants are landing in what is today recognized as Ghana and northern Nigeria. They would call that the Gold Coast. Later we see them landing in Senegal and Sierra Leone, but where they really dominate is the Gold Coast. And they call it the Gold Coast because the Akan-speaking people then to this day are some of the world's greatest goldsmiths. But as they arrive there, they also find that there's a demand for slave labor to work on large sugar plantations and coffee plantations, not in New England. Remember, in New England, we have bad soil and bad weather. It's always ironic for me that we changed the name plantation because so many people connected plantation and slavery, when in fact, most of the Africans that eventually arrived here enslaved would live, work, worship, eventually die in urban centers. Because in the colonial era, it's the urban centers are the center of the economic activity. It's the New London, Connecticut, Boston, Massachusetts, Bristol, Providence, Newport, Rhode Island, Bridgeport, Connecticut, New Haven, Connecticut, Portsmouth, New Hampshire. That's where the large numbers of Africans are because that's where the work is for them to do. Yes, there are Africans working in small farms, but these are not cash crop, large production farms. We're not producing sugar or cotton or tobacco or rice. So for the most part, those that were enslaved on small farms, alongside surviving indigenous people, in many cases intermarrying with indigenous people, it's not a large-scale commercial activity. Animal husbandry, horse raising, some corn, some potatoes, and most of it was done to support the shipping trade. But the real numbers of Africans that are enslaved in New England are the urban seaports. And later that becomes important because that's an important opportunity for their freedom. In fact, the first underground railroad system in the 18th century is the sea. It's through the maritime areas. 100 years before what we recognize today as Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad of the Americas south to the Midwest and eventually to Canada. And I just want to point out that one of the things we were able to do is to really look carefully at the actual primary data about not only where Africans came from, who was brought here, why they were brought here, and who led that effort. And I just want to use a term here that I hope resonates with everyone. The term I've been using is African heritage, not African American, not black, not BIPOC, because they saw themselves as Africans. In fact, we have letters, primary letters, where they're joking and saying, they call us Negro, they call us black, we're African. And in fact, you see as they interacted with other Africans, not only in New England, but through the West Indies and back to Africa. They're writing letters back to their tribal leaders, Fanti-speaking, Akan-speaking tongue, Yoruba people, and they're saying, we're African. That's how they see themselves. That's who they are. That's their identity. So it's important to recognize that. But what we do know, and what you can see there, is that between 1705 and 1806, what we call the golden age of our maritime economy, there are at least 934 documented slave voyages. Close to 75% come from Newport. And I just want to be very clear. Today we embellish that. Today we hear more about John Brown as a slave trader, James the Wolf, Bristol, Providence. But the facts are, Newport is the most active and largest slave trading center. And there are slave merchants much larger than the Wolf and Brown combined. And the best way to characterize it is the African slave trade, the triangular slave trade, was an equal opportunity employer. Every race, every ethnicity, every religion participated. Some more organized than others, but everyone participated. And that's why it sustained itself for so long. In Newport, my community, the earliest slave owners and traders are Quakers. And I was joking to someone before, my late grandmother used to call Quakers in Newport, 1 foot in the counting house and 1 foot in the meeting house. And when the Quaker meeting came together and said we will divorce ourselves from the trade, those that wanted to continue all became Anglicans and Trinity Episcopal Church. And the Sephardic Jews that arrived and those that were merchants were slave traders. It had nothing to do with them being Jews. It had everything to do with the fact that they were 18th century merchants who wanted to make money, just like their Christian counterparts. And what becomes even more ironic, as I spent time in Ghana, the complicity reaches into the Africans themselves. The Fonte coastal African leaders directly traded with Rhode Island merchants along the West African coast. They would engage Ashanti warriors to march inland, raid villages, capture, march them back to the waterfront, place them in castles, and then they would then barter with Rhode Island merchants and ships. In fact, the Fonte leaders called the Rhode Island merchants rum men, because the commodity of trade for enslaved men, women, and children is rum. Rum drives. What we do well in Rhode Island, we can't grow anything, but we can make rum. And if I could take you back to the mid part of the 17th, 18th century, and it's Josiah Linden, our governor at that time, in 1765, we have his letter. He sends a letter to the British Board of Trade saying, this thing called a sugar tax is going to be devastating to us. If you tax sugar, you're taxing the one commodity that we have worldwide presence, and we're providing significant revenue to the crown. And he goes on to say, our county Rhode Island's about 40 miles long, about 20 miles wide, the soil's barren, and it's molasses and sugar that is imported from the West Indies, that we distill into rum, that we trade from our Africans, who are the workers in the West Indies, and sell into the European markets. If I could take you back to 1770, before the American Revolution, there were 30 rum distilleries in Rhode Island. We control about 80% of the Guinea rum market, 24 in Newport alone. It's rum. So it's important to recognize that this complicity, which is economically driven, it envelops, it blinds all men, women, families, regardless of race. There's a Quaker woman in Newport that makes this wonderful statement where she's bemoaning the fact that Quakers, and so many are involved in the trade, and she just says, so does custom keep men blinded. It's the custom of making money. It's the custom of prosperity on the backs of men, women, and children. And in fact, John Brown himself points out the fact that, don't talk about me. You guys are mad at me because of the salad ship. Go look at Newport. Every estate that was built at that time was built on the Guinea trade or the rum trade. So I want to be absolutely clear to the fact that Little Rhode Island, that is founded on religious freedom and toleration, it's attracting people who are persecuted, these same people at the exact same time and space in history are now moving efficiently, effectively, and successfully in human trade, in the transatlantic slave trade. And I just want to talk a little bit about the dominating of the trade, because again, it is so dominant. One of the things that we found, which was fascinating, I was in Ghana about 4 years ago, and actually physically at what is called Fort William at Ananabo. People talk about the Cape Coast Castle, which is the largest castle. It's in Accra, the capital of Ghana. Everyone goes there, President Obama, everyone's there, but Rhode Island merchants were actually landing at Fort William, which is still intact. And what's fascinating about that, and it's hard to see, is that the Rhode Island merchants had such a close relationship with Africans. They also found that most that we enslave are going to send to the West Indies at high value to work on sugar plantations, coffee plantations. But here in New England and back in Rhode Island, we don't have big farms and plantations. We don't need big, strong men. We have trade. It's trade skills. We need men and women to work on our trade skills. We need barrel makers, silversmiths, carpenters, shipwrights, all the things that go on in the urban seaport. That's what we need. So one of the great anomalies is that many of the Africans that eventually brought back to Rhode Island are children under the age of 12. My own ancestor, 8 years old, in 1795, is brought from Jamaica to Philadelphia to Newport, and he's being trained as a Windsor chairmaker, and later cabinet maker, in a Quaker household. Now I want you to remember that, because the African children that arrived here, which is horrendous, how could a child, how could anyone survive the transatlantic trip? But they did. And how could a child be brought on the bows of a ship, chained like cattle, as a commodity, and then on their own be dropped into a new place into a foreign family and now have to learn a trade skill. But they did, by the thousands. And I just want to be clear, I'm not making an emotional statement that this makes us any better or worse, South or North, West Indies. I'm just simply saying the economies of New England would create a certain unique circumstance of how Africans would arrive, who would arrive, and the work that they would do. So what you find here, and particularly Rhode Island, but certainly New England, is that it's this rum-driven slave trade that begins to also be supported by the trades. To have rum, you need rum distilleries. To store rum, you need barrels. You need barrel makers, coopers. You need builders. So you begin to see in New England generally, but particularly in places like Boston and Newport and the larger urban areas, thousands of African children being brought in. And as they're arriving, it's important to recognize something. These children, they're living in the same household as master and mistress. In many cases, they're sharing the same spaces. They're children. They're 8, 9, 10, 12, what threat would that be? They're learning trade skills, so they're having access to education and training. Now, to the specific benefit of its master and mistress, but they're still having access to training. And more importantly, they have access to religion. There's a second great awakening movement going on in the 18th century across the country, but certainly New England, where you're seeing this massive conversion of the few remaining indigenous people and the African people, children, into Christianity. And some of the things that we found, we'll show you in a few slides, was fascinating, where all of the leading clergy at that time are competing with each other to convert what was called Negroes, which we know as Africans. So this access to co-living, working together, worshiping together, which would have been unheard of and unlawful in the American South and West Indies, is embraced here. So it gives Africans an opportunity for education and identity that would not exist anywhere else for Africans who were enslaved. And I just want to be clear with this because it's not a better or worse. We in New England sometimes look down upon our southern counterparts as if slavery and racism began in Mobile, Alabama, and not Cranston, Rhode Island. But we have to be clear to the fact that in the 18th century, the beginnings of the America, the beginnings that lead to the American Revolution, African slave trade, African enslavement, and indigenous enslavement is wholly a New England champion commodity. And we need to recognize that. But it's unique based upon our economic, our social, our religious, and even environmental circumstances. So what begins to happen for these Africans? They're living, worshiping, working together. In many cases, we have these incredible records of Africans that are in the synagogue in Newport. 6 are listed as Israelites. And if you come to Newport, we have the oldest African burying ground existing in the country called God's Laker. And there's an entire section where Africans that were in Jewish households are buried and taking on Jewish names and identities. And if it was a Quaker household, it's a Quaker identity. Baptist, so on and so on. And what becomes unique about that is the fact that they're now worshiping within those places of worship. In the First Baptist Church that I talked about a few minutes ago in Providence, we have records where Africans, a large number of Africans, are worshiping the First Baptist meeting house. Now, it's a second-class worship. They sit in the back of what we call as Anglicans nursing pews, the old back pews where we put the moms and babies if they're a little bit too loud, or they're up in the top in the garret, or toward the choir loft, and they're never able to participate in services and communions and such. But by the fact that they're at least inside the 4 walls, that's pretty much an advancement compared to the rest of the world at that time. But these Africans are frustrated with that. And you begin to see Africans start to have this discourse of, we believe in the light, Christ. We're good religious members, but we're not a part of the congregation. Why do we see ourselves as separate and apart? And what's fascinating is that they're also suggesting, why are we, as a colony, and soon to become a new United States and a new state of Rhode Island, why are we still having a hand in African slavery and slave trade? And what the religious response is fascinating. We do not have a right to own your soul. God owns your soul. And when you convert to Christianity, you and I, master and slave, are equal under God. And when we both die, we will be equal, standing side by side with God. But while I live, while you live, I own your labor. God owns your soul, I own your labor. So this was the rationalization. Again, it's an 18th century rationalization. It's not a good, bad, or different. It's an 18th century. But you can understand why so many would embrace and support. And you would begin to have statements such as, better to be an enslaved African in the enlightened New England with Christ than be in the black, benighted, look at the terms they use, Africa, the darkness, and no understanding of the light in Christ. So it's this justification belief system that carries forward and sustains, the 3.5 centuries of African enslavement. And I want to begin to talk about some of the clergy that start to separate themselves from this. The two most important leaders in the abolition of the ending of slavery, and not only Rhode Island and America, are Moses Brown in Providence and Reverend Samuel Hopkins of the First Congregational Church in Newport. We're very proud. In fact, it's hard to see there, but our family actually owns the 1770 installation sermon of Reverend Hopkins by Reverend Ezra Stiles of the Second Congregational Church. Our family have been early congregations tied to Newport from white and black churches for hundreds of years. But Samuel Hopkins becomes the first leader, religious leader in America, who begins to actively talk about not only abolishing slavery, but once Africans convert and see the light become a part of a parish and congregation, they're equal. There's no separation. Now, most people who believe that slavery should be abolished were comfortable with that, but no one was comfortable that there would be social equality. But Hopkins believed that. He's the first to interpret that. He sends treaties and letters to the New Continental Congress saying, you talk about taxation without representation, but your enslavement of Negroes is not much different. He goes on to begin to really feel that we are one people in this country, and Africans deserve the right to express their rights as free people. In fact, before the American Revolution, 1774, Hopkins gets together with Stiles, he talks to Moses Brown, and they have an idea where let's send Africans back to Africa to bring the gospel, but also to help enlighten them and improve them. So in 1774, right before the American Revolution, two African men, a John Camino of Newport, a barrel maker, then later a mariner, and a Bristol Young, a storekeeper, they're sent to the College of New Jersey under President Witherspoon to become the first two African men in the country to enroll in college, with the express purpose of sending them back not only to Africa, but specifically to Ananago in West Africa, where they would engage and convert and support more Africans. The American Revolution breaks out, it disrupts their studies, it never happens. But what's more important is Hopkins continues this belief with Moses Brown. And in fact, another group leaves Providence and lands in Sierra Leone. And we have the records for that. And it's fascinating because Moses Brown, who's not really a Baptist or a Quaker, and Hopkins is concerned that, I don't want Quakers leading this. I'm still concerned with Quakers. And I want them to be pious congregational Christians, never really supports the Providence group. So it never really happens. But they're corresponding and they're talking about this. And this isn't sending people to Africa because we don't need them. It's Africans wanting to come back to their country, back to their origins. And led by Moses Brown, who would go on to pass the first abolition legislation in Rhode Island by 1784. And Samuel Hopkins, who would go on to found and establish, what's most importantly, what we call today the first emancipation. We're celebrating Juneteenth tomorrow over the weekend. Let me be clear. Juneteenth as a recognition celebration never existed in the north of New England. August 1st, Emancipation Day, is what's been celebrated and recognized. We have records around Black Heritage Society of large events, thousands of people of African and some whites at Roger Williams Park, then later Crescent Park and Goddard Park, all coming together to celebrate August 1st, Emancipation Day. August 1st, because that is the date that the British West Indies in 1834 would emancipate enslaved African men, women, and children. But before that, between 1777 and about 1790, with the formation of the new United States, starting with Vermont, and then later all the others, including Rhode Island, they would all abolish slavery. So by the end of the 18th century, something occurred that didn't happen before. 100,000 trained, educated, pious, free African people now existed in early America. And what did they do? They began to express that freedom by creating an African identity as Africans in America. Not African Americans, not colored, not Negro, but as Africans. And in fact, what you begin seeing is the beginnings of the first African institutions, social, religious, benevolent, educational. And it's not happening in the American South. Slavery is still in place. There are still 4 million African men, women, and children of heritage enslaved. But by the end of the 18th century, you begin to see the rudiments of the first free African institutions. And almost each and every one of them begin on this date, November 10th, 1780. On that date in Newport, 24 free African men come together, all tradesmen, in the home of Abraham Casey. Today it's Memorial Boulevard and Thames Street. There's a post office there. Abraham Casey is a master chocolate grinder. Abraham Casey and those African men come together. It's hard to see the names. And they form for the first time the Free African Union Society. We know that because the records still exist. They're in the collections of the Rhode Black Heritage Society, Newport Historical Society. And this Free African Society had 3 purposes. One, we're going to create a census and document every single African enslaved and free in Newport. Where do you live? Where do you work? What country do you come from? What's your language? What's your job? What's your career? Do your children need education? We want to know everything about you, and those records still exist. Second, we want to get the word out and make sure that every free Africans in this New England northern area have the same organizational opportunities as we did. And in doing that, they also begin to create networks of African societies. 1780 is the first one in Newport, 1787 in Philadelphia, 1787 in Boston, and 1789 in Providence. Every single of those African meeting houses would evolve into some of the earliest free African churches in America. In Providence, the African meeting house with land purchased by Moses Brown and gifted to the African community would later evolve in what is today the oldest free black church in Rhode Island, one of the oldest in America, Cardinal Street Baptist Church. In Newport, they're Congregationalists. They're following Samuel Hopkins. It becomes a Union Colored Congregational Church, which was part of my family's parish. In Philadelphia, 2 African men are corresponding. I mean, this is where I'm a nerd, a history nerd. Africans in Newport are talking to their counterparts in these communities. In Newport, they're talking to 2 African men in Philadelphia, Reverend Absalom Jones and Reverend Richard Allen. Reverend Richard Allen goes on to found the first African Methodist Episcopal Church, Mother Bethel. Absalom Jones founds the first African Episcopal Church in St. Thomas. I have ancestors that are pew holders and members of those churches in the 18th and early 19th century. In Boston, they're talking to a man named Prince Hall, who goes on to found the first African affiliate Masonic order. And again, we know this because we have the letters. And they're all talking about, let's take our freedom, our trade, our African identity, and let's create African institutions in America. We are the black founders of America. And we are looking not to integrate, not to assimilate, not to placate. We're looking to be interdependent, what we talked about earlier. We are creating our own institutions for our own benefit so that we can prosper as free Africans in America. We're not looking to compete. We're not looking to assimilate. We don't want to be a part of white churches. You don't want us. We don't want to be a part of your neighborhoods. You don't want us. We don't want to marry your daughters because ours are more attractive. But let me be clear, it's interdependence that they're espousing. And when you begin to see by the 18th into the 19th century, there's all of these free African communities all popping up. In fact, many of them take on African names. In Bristol, it's New Gory. In New Haven, it's Little Gory. Bridgeport, Connecticut, what is it called? Little Liberia. It's Negro Town in Newport, and then Negro Lane. In Providence, before it's called Hardscrabble and Snowtown, it's actually called Squaw Hollow because of the intermarriage, interconnection between Africans and indigenous people. And when we think about those early settling places, in Providence, it's College Hill. In Newport, it's historic Hill Bellevue Avenue. In Philadelphia, it's the downtown 7th Ward. And in Boston, it's the north slope of Beacon Hill. Could you imagine if people of color still own properties in those areas today? There would not be a racial wealth gap, I can guarantee you. But we do not. But many of the historic structures and properties that exist in those historic neighborhoods today were African heritage owned, operated, and lived in and worshipped in. And very few people would recognize that today. And you're going to have to bring me back. This is a whole story of how we were moved out by riots, by urban renewal, and other policies and practices, leading well into the 20th century. But during this founding period, it's exciting, it's cool. And what you begin to see, as I said, it's the black founders, these men, and the women follow suit. By the beginning of the 19th century, African women who were tied to these meeting houses and tied to these early places of worship are founding their own African female benevolent societies. There's one in Philadelphia, in Newport, it's called the Free Female Benevolent Society. There's one in Boston. They're all focused on two important issues. Making sure that as husbands are dying because they're out to sea and it's hard work, that there's money set aside in insurance for widows and their children, and they're focused on education. In fact, they're so focused on education, I'm getting ahead of myself. By 1808, March 22nd, very specific on the dates, the African Female Society in Newport corresponds with their counterparts in Boston, and they form the first free African schools in America. Free meaning, we own it, we operate it, we teach it. And in Newport, we still have the records of the children who were part of those free African schools. And the building that doesn't exist anymore was on School Street. It took the name in the historic Hill community along Bellevue Avenue. So what's important here is that even though Africans arrived in the worst circumstance, enslaved chattel property, earlier in this country's history, and certainly early before most other African Americans are free and emancipated from the Civil War, they're prospering. And at the center of their prosperity is their black church. Because the black church then was the only place where you could come together, congregate, share your religion, and then after, talk about politics, talk about education, talk about social justice, talk about anything you please without a white oversight or a white intervention. And in fact, the very beginnings of what we recognize today as a Martin Luther King, that combination of pulpit and politics, was all beginning at this time. And one of the most important men that are tied to that is my great-great-uncle in Newport, Reverend Malon Van Horn. Malon Van Horn is the pastor of the Union Colored Congregational Church. Just went out. I'll try to project while you try to fix it. Malon Van Horn arrives in 1869. He's the first graduate of what is today Lincoln University, which is the oldest historically black college university, private. He's brought to Newport by a group of black leaders for the specific purpose of establishing the congregation, but also creating a political and social justice movement. Because even though we're free and the Civil War is over, we still don't have all the rights that we deserve and should have as fellow citizens. We fought in the American Revolution, we fought in the Civil War, we pay taxes, but we're still treated as second-class citizens. And Malon Van Horn, as a part of a strategy of the community, by 1872, he's elected for the first time as the first person of color in Rhode Island on a Newport school board. And that's done strategically because schools were still segregated in Rhode Island up until 1868. So they strategically placed him as the head of a school board to ensure that the policies and practices would ensure that children of African descent also had access to education, to books, to supplies, to good teachers. In 1885, the community came together and had him elected as the first person of color in the Rhode Island General Assembly. And his first act was to pass one of the first civil rights laws in Rhode Island that allowed and enjoined all Rhode Island citizens, regardless of race or religion or previous condition of servitude, equal rights. And then later, Van Horn, I hope that's working because I'm losing my voice. There we go, much better. And later, Van Horn, who's a political operative, he's friends with Frederick Douglass, he's barnstorming all across the country, particularly in Rhode Island. And President McKinley, at the beginning of this, what we today recognize as Spanish-American War, nominates him to become one of the few men of color as a general counsel. And he becomes general counsel to the Danish West Indies, later to be the U.S. Virgin Islands. And during that time, he became a critical national proponent of equal rights, all coming from Little Rhode Island. But one of the most important things that he did at his time, not from the pulpit, but a political speech in Providence. And we have copies for you, a gift from around Black Heritage Society. In 1887, he presents a political speech, and it's simply called The Negro in Rhode Island, His Past, Present, and Future. And if you read this speech, he talks about the path of future Rhode Island for Negroes is to understand the past. We were firmly rooted in slavery. And he gives a record of who the slave traders were, where the slave markets were in Newport. He then goes on to say, it is religion that provides us an opportunity for self-enjoyment, for prosperity, and equality. And then he goes on to say that the real key for the future Rhode Island, he actually points out the fact that this founding of this Rhode Island, and you can kind of see the language there, this lively experiment was not made for us. And until we enjoy the same rights as every citizen, regardless of our race or previous condition of servitude, the lively experiment falls on hollow ears. The freedom of religion extends to just only a few. And one of the most important things that he believed in writing this was, he did an inventory of every person of African descent in Newport who owned property. Hundreds of people owned properties. Places of worship, their buildings, their stores, and said, this is the future, equity. Once you own something and build wealth, I'm paraphrasing just a bit, it's something you hold on to and you pass on to the next generation. And if you look at the history of racialized discrimination that has evolved over the years, it's always tied to removing people from their wealth, forbidding a people to build, keep, and pass on wealth to the next generation. That's why they take your land, or public policies don't allow you to buy a home, or own a business. It's always to separate you from wealth. And it's Van Horn in 1887 is recognizing, saying the path to freedom and equality, it's wealth generation. And all we want as people of Negro and today African American heritage is an independent opportunity, get a job, good education, own a home, own a business, build wealth, and someday pass it on to the next generation. His primer then is a primer that we're still wrestling with to this day. I'm only going to say one modern day statistic because I'm going to stay in history, but it's important to me because I've been trained more in policy and economics than history. Providence, Rhode Island, where we sit today, is one of the lowest black homeownership rates in the nation. Not Newark, New Jersey, not Chicago, not New Orleans, Providence, Rhode Island. And I think we all can agree homeownership is the most efficient, truest, fastest path of building equity, particularly with the cost of housing and how it's accelerated to this day. So by the very fact that very few people of African descent, and Latinos are not far behind, unfortunately, and then other newly arriving immigrants, Southeast Asians and such, the fact that they don't have that basic opportunity to build wealth, they will not survive and will not sustain themselves. So it's just important to recognize that Van Horn understood that, and he tried to convey that message back in 1887. So I'm going to stop here because I just wanted to, again, almost an hour now, but so much history. But one of the things I just want to convey, and I'll try to answer any questions you might have from this, is that history on its factual face is not black or white or good or bad. It's always shades of gray. And what today some call hard history, the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society under Rowena Stewart, our founder, coined in the late 1980s, creative survival. There is nothing in the history of African heritage people that is hard, is difficult, is tragic, only because of the fact that we're still here. Unlike any other group in the Americas, we're still here. And what's fascinating, I'll actually give you a second modern day demographic statistic. What's fascinating is that today here in North America, not British North America anymore, the United States of America, we are finding ourselves in a transformative period of demographics. By 2050, the majority of people in the United States will be people of color led by Latinos. That's the facts. If I could take you back to the 2020 census, Latinos and Spanish-speaking people represented 43% of the Providence city population. That's reported. That's just reported. By the midterm census analysis next year, that's approaching 50%. But I don't have to tell you that. You see it. We see it everywhere we go. The people we interact with. My wife's from Guatemala. My wife used to joke with me almost 40 years ago, I'm the first Guatemalan in Rhode Island, in Newport. They called her Italian, they called her Portuguese, they said Cape Verdean. She goes, what's a Cape Verdean? They said, no, Guatemalan. Today, in 2024, we have 5,000 Guatemalans and count on Aquidneck Island. They're doing all of our landscaping, the state work, they're doing all the back of house hospitality. My poor wife had no good food. Now we've got 3 bodegas, and we have great restaurants, good food, and she's not the only Guatemalan. But what's most important is this transformation that's going on simply states the United States, the old British North America, is going to look like the rest of the Americas. The people are going to look like South and Central America, like the West Indies, which have already recognized and already grown those populations. So knowing this history isn't just simply a process of knowing history. It's not a social justice activity. It's a recognition that the future of our city, our state, our country is now based upon the success of people of color, of young people of color. And they need to have access to wealth generation. They need to have access to independent choices because they are going to be the future of this city, this state, this nation. That is a fact. That has nothing to do with social justice and diversity, inclusion, and equity and belonging. It's a fact. The future visitors, the future vendors, the future parishioners are going to represent that demographic. In Newport, we have 2 Catholic churches, which were always Irish Portuguese churches during my lifetime, now have services in Spanish. And why? It's the only way they're going to survive as a Catholic diocese. Because Irish and Portuguese and Italians have grown up and grown out, and they're not representing the young family. So the reality that I present to you today is this history and understanding this history, as what Van Horn said, is a pathway to the future of prosperity. And that prosperity is to allow every single individual to have independent choice, regardless of their race, religion, gender, or how they worship God or not. And by doing that, we'll be successful. If we don't do it, we'll die out. So let me stop there and give a big drink of water, and then I'm here to answer any questions you might have. And again, we'll certainly leave a bibliography because there's some incredible scholars much brighter than I that can provide you further reading and further research into this topic. So again, thank you for having me. Thank you. Do we have time going for questions? Again, if there's any questions or such, please.
Yeah, you piqued my interest. The early churches, just after the Revolution, were they?
I'm used to the old-fashioned mics. Yeah. The early churches after the Revolution, were they predominantly people that were still enslaved, or were they freedmen?
Yep. No. Again, by 1777 and about 1790, all New England and nearly all northern states abolished slavery, either immediately or over a period of time. So by the beginning of the 19th century, if you happen to be in Boston, Philadelphia, New York, Newport, it's largely a free African community. There are over 100,000 free Africans now living in America, in New England and the North. And those are the ones that are taking the lead in establishing their African identities by their places of worship, their schools, their education, their civic organizations. There are a few that are still enslaved. And in some cases, they have some freedom to worship in their place of choice in an African meeting house. In other cases, not so much. But for the most part, the lion's share, the far majority are free, and they're exercising that freedom as Africans in New England and early northern America. The other thing I just want to point out with this is, and I should have, most of the Africans that were brought here are not only children, but as you remember, they're coming from the Gold Coast, as it was called. They're coming unified in their culture, their political identity, their language. Elsewhere around the Americas, Africans are being brought in from everywhere. Just strong, do the work, die, and replace you. The life expectancy of a Jamaican sugar plantation in the 18th century was 6 months. So they were always replenishing. And the same across the West Indies into the South and Central America. So here, for the more part, there was less of an interest in volume, but more quality. And I'm saying that separate as a historian and not from an emotional standpoint. So as young African children were coming, and some young adults, they still had intact their African identity. Fanti speaking, Akan speaking people from what is today Ghana, Yoruba speaking people from Nigeria. And you see that played out in like Jamaica, Barbados, largely Yoruba, largely Akan. In fact, if you come to Newport, come to our burying ground, that old burying ground, many of the markers actually have African day naming tradition. You know that tradition? If you're born in the Akan family, then into this day, the day of the week you're born or your birth order, you're giving a certain day name. Boys born on Friday are called Kofi, K-O-F-I. We anglicize it phonetically, we pronounce it as Cuffy, like the Paul Cuffy School. There are thousands and thousands of Cuffys in Newport, Boston, tens of thousands in Jamaica and Barbados. It's Quaker if it's Saturday. And that sometimes has Q's and K's and such. Those are day naming. In fact, when Africans became free and they converted to religion, they stopped blending the names. They're giving their children their day names, but they take on their Christian name. So the most famous African at that time, Paul Cuffy, the mariner, his father was enslaved by the Slocum household. And when he becomes free, he's a Quaker. He drops the Slocum name, and he becomes Paul Cuffy, and recognizing his father as a Akan tradition. So one of the things we're able to do, because we're looking at history not from a Euro lens, or not from an owner class lens, we're looking at it from the lens of the African people. So I work with scholars in Ghana, Barbados, West Indies, Jamaica. I physically go to Ghana and see Rhode Island shipwrecks. I'm in Jamaica, and I'm seeing Rhode Island merchants and owners of plantations. I'm in Barbados, in Bridgetown, the capital, and every other name is a Newport name or a Providence name from streets and businesses. But what's most important, they also have intact their African identities and heritage. So this is a whole new chapter of understanding history, but particularly from the viewpoint of a people who have been forgotten and lost. And what's exciting for me, again, as kind of a wonkish history person, is when I take kids of color, kids of African descent, and we bring them to Newport and they go to the burying ground, and they'll stop and go, that's my papa's name. We actually have markers that survive that the African Society in Newport, and they wanted to make sure that they not only had African names and identities, at the time when you died, you had an image of an angel. We call it deathbed. And that angel recognized in Christian religion life everlasting and rising up to heaven, your soul. We have angels that have African features. And I can't tell you how exciting that is for young African heritage people who get to come to Newport and say, wait, you're telling me not everyone looked like George and Martha Washington? I'm from Nigeria. Look at that name. That speaks to me. So by presenting this history, I can't tell you how powerful it is for kids who've always felt left out. And it's not that they're mad at Thomas Jefferson being a slave owner. We're just tired of hearing about Thomas Jefferson. We're tired of hearing about James the Wolf. We're tired of hearing about John Brown. That's not our story. And in fact, one of the terms we're now using, and we tested this out as we were developing the reparations work in Providence, and I got people mad at me. So let me tell you the story, and you can tell me if I was right or wrong. We determined that if we're going to begin to think about reparations in the city of Providence from the colonial period going forward, we have to recognize that it's not simply Providence isolated. Providence was actively engaged in the transatlantic slave trade, impacting countries, people across the diaspora. So the term we used was not African American, we used African heritage. And we defined that as being African born, African American, Cape Verdean, Afro Caribbean, Afro Latino. And some black folks got really mad at me. I mean, some good friends came and said, Keith, you're wrong. Wait, this is for us. Reparations is for me, an African American from slavery. I live in Providence. Not Jamaicans, not Haitians, not Nigerians, not them, me. And my response was simply, where did your grandparents come from? They came from the South, and got to Providence in the 1940s, lived in Roger Williams' home. And I said, no, before the South, where do they come from? Okay, Keith, I get it. Yeah, probably Africa. I said, well, stop. I can almost guarantee you it's Africa, to the West Indies, and eventually to Providence, Rhode Island. Now, you tell me, what's the difference of being colonized and oppressed by English, Spanish, Dutch, and French? If you happen to land in the Dominican Republic, you're colonized by the Spanish. Next door, it's the French. It's the Dutch and Barbados. So the only difference from someone in the Dominican Republic and you is that you're next to boat trip from Ghana. But you're all a part of the African diaspora. You may not want to recognize that. You may not want to feel that, but that is the facts. And if we're going to help people in Providence today in 2022, we have to recognize that the culpability and the impact people from across the diaspora, past and present and future. And that was a heady discussion we had at the time. There was a lot of understanding that this is going to be unique and that we might have to share. But my point being is that if you follow the history, you follow the facts, it's always a part of the diaspora. We're a part of a large group of people. And if we ever united, I go back to the demographics I said. In the next 25 years, people of color led by Latinos, particularly Afro-Latinos, Caribbean Latinos, will be the majority. And if we could all unify by culture, by history and identity, we're going to decide who the next president, mayor, council, school committee is. We're going to make the decisions. But if we separate ourselves, because you're Cape Verdean over here, you're Dominican over here, and you're Nigerian over here, we fail. And the small minority continues to rule. So history is really being used to provide the facts. One, to ensure everyone understands the total history of Rhode Island or America. But secondly, it's used to empower young people of color so they can understand you have every right to succeed in this state, in this country, as more than anyone. Most of this country was a Spanish-speaking country, well before it became British North America. And we need to recognize that. Some of the oldest cities that still exist in America, like St. Augustine, are Spanish. And now, 350 years later, it caught up. And Spanish will be the majority. And they will impact the culture, the business, the religion, everything that's in America will all be impacted by that. But we've been waiting for 350 years to get to it. And here we are. Any other quick questions? It's very warm. Yes.
My question is, you referenced the word plantation in the name of Rhode Island. Could you just review that again real quick?
Rhode Island was established as a colony of Rhode Island Providence plantations. Plantations meaning farms. It had indigenous and later enslaved Africans work as forced labor on farms and plantation Rhode Island? Absolutely. It's well documented, well understood. The challenge is that it's not synonymous to the antebellum South. And one of the great questions I have as a historian from New England is separating the antebellum South from colonial New England. It's not to say one was better or worse, it's just different economic, social, religious circumstance. And I also get frustrated because when I lecture in the South, people look at me and say, Rhode Island? What? Rhode Island? There's no black people in Rhode Island. There's more cows than black people in Rhode Island. And I have to say, stop. Most of the African identities we know in America began in places like Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and Portsmouth, Rhode Island. But they wouldn't know that because they don't understand the history. But there was a movement from the George Floyd tragedy that people felt obligated to do something. We have to do something. That George Floyd movement, and then with COVID, young people felt, we've got to do something. We've got to make a change. And we're not going to create wealth overnight or home ownership, but we at least can drop that name. And it became a symbol. I believe the removal of the plantation name was more of a symbol so that people of color were saying, would you see we're here? Recognize us? And the best way to get your attention is to take your history. That's why we destroyed and removed Confederate memorials. It was done not to simply change history or eradicate history. It was to get everyone's attention saying, you've taken from us, you ignored us for 3.5 centuries. We're going to do something to shake you to your core. We're taking your heroes down. It didn't get people worked up. It worked, it did exactly what it planned to do. It got people thinking, boy, we're really excluding a large part of our population. We need to do something. And the plantation removal did something very positive. From that year, I worked with the legislature, Governor McKee, the Black Heritage Society, and that same year we passed, very quietly, a K-12 African Heritage History curriculum. Rhode Island will soon be the first state in the country to have a full K-12 African Heritage History curriculum, starting with Africa before European colonization. We're not going to start with slavery, we're not going to cover John Brown, we're going to start with the great kingdoms of the continent of Africa, and those that had direct influence in the building and sustaining of British North America, and particularly Rhode Island, and then we'll go forward. But that would not have happened without young people coming and marching. It would not have happened if we weren't fighting on plantations, because it gave us, as all wonkish, kind of nerdy people, to go behind the scenes and say, okay, finally we can move this curriculum forward. And the fact that we're using African heritage history, it's going to be inclusive. We'll talk about the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, Barbados. We'll talk about all the Cape Verdeans, right? We have a whole chapter on the Cape Verdean life. Because again, Cape Verde is off the coast of Senegal, not Portugal. So we're quite excited about this work, but it would not have happened if it wasn't for the young activists who were, again, putting right in the establishment's face, we're going to take something away from you until you recognize us. So we think it was good for our strength. Plantations for our curriculum. Yes?
First, let me just say thank you for sharing.
Thank you very much for being here tonight and sharing all this information and the facts. I think we can all appreciate what you had to share with us this evening. My original question was about what efforts are being made from the Black Heritage Society to work with the state to bring this curriculum into the classrooms so that we can all learn and appreciate it more, and our kids, more importantly, would have the opportunity to continue to prosper from knowing their history. And you answered the question, even asked yourself, I'm very happy to hear that. I think maybe, I don't know if the governor can hear or not, to hear that it's going to be introduced into our kids' curriculum here in the state of Rhode Island is tremendous. So thank you for your efforts for getting that done.
No, thank you. I'm going to give you all a hint on two projects that will be evolving from it soon. As any of you know, as teachers here as such, you know better than I, the professional development piece is key. We have to empower our teachers so they're teaching, comfortably, safely, without looking over their shoulders. We also have to recognize that units of instruction curriculum for elementary is different from middle school, which is different from high school. Very cognizant of that. The other thing we recognize is we brought a focus group of teachers in. I mean, the unions have been wonderful. And one of the things that we found is that, and this is not a surprise, learning for many kids today, it's their cell phone, it's the social media. I'm not saying that's good, bad, or indifferent, I'm just saying that's what it is. So just give them a book, you gotta lead them into it. So one of the things we'll be creating by the end of the year is a African Heritage web portal. And we've got some wonderful designers working with us. So what it will look like, you're getting the inside picture. It'll be a web portal fully funded by private philanthropy. Every Rhode Island teacher and student will be on for free. There is no cost to that. When you go on, it will have a map of all Rhode Island. And then there'll be a sub-bar with decades and then certain topics. And on that map, you can click on West Greenwich, East Greenwich, Barrington, Providence, Newport. And then it'll bring you into a 90-second to 2-minute TikTok-like video. And we've been producing them over the last year. So they've got me as an old man talking head, and then I've got really young men and women who are kind of interpreting my talking head and saying what this is. So kids will get kind of a TikTok, YouTube introduction to a lesson plan, a story, or narrative. And then after that, they go through it. Here's the lesson plan. Here's the bibliography on computer research. We are digitizing. Senator Jack Reed has gotten a grant to the Black Heritage Society. Every single item collection is being digitized. Digitized. Every single item. Every pamphlet, every book, every piece of furniture. We have a show in Newport right now at the Rosecliff Mansion called Gilded Age Newport in Color. We have over 100 19th century photographs and cabinet cards on display of people of color in Providence, Newport, across the state that nobody's ever seen before. But through this web portal, it'll all be online. So if that young person's walking around with their phone as they do, they can click on, go on, and have access to a world before they get to the classroom. Hopefully it inspires them and says, now I want to learn something in the classroom. I was really excited about learning about that place of burial, about that worship, about Scallop Town in East Greenwich. about Snowtown and Providence. Now I want to know more about that. So that's really exciting coming forward. The second thing that we're doing, we just finished our beta test this year. Last Saturday we had our graduation. Is we've created a program called Birthright Rhode Island. I'm also vice president and I chair the education of the Maternal Synagogue. My maternal grandmother was a part of the early Jewish members of Newport. My maternal grandfather was a part of the early African settlers, and they married in 1902. But what's important is that I've been to Israel a number of times. I understand Birthright Israel, which is a wonderful program that ensures that every Jewish child has the ability to go back to Israel and learn firsthand the story of their people in their country. Well, we want to do the same thing. We've created Birthright Rhode Island. And in Birthright Rhode Island, students of color, or any student, will have the right to travel back through the diaspora and learn firsthand their African heritage and identity by physically being in those places and learning the history. Simultaneously, they're being placed in mentorship training and entrepreneurship programs with skills around the future where they're learning and accelerating their trade. This past year, our first class of 20 people graduated, 19 young ladies coming from the med schools, some of the Providence schools, and this spring, we took them to the U.S. Virgin Islands so they could walk in the footsteps of Reverend Van Horn when he was general counsel there and learn about the diaspora from the Virgin Islands. Next year, their capstone is they're going to Ghana, and they'll physically get to go to Anabo and see the slave porches where they originated with and interact with students and scholars from the University of Cape Coast. We also this year brought them to Newport, and they met a group of young men and women who are Marine Navy officers of color and learned about leadership. And later this summer, and we're very excited about this program, it's cool. We're doing cool things so kids get excited. Later this summer, the kids are going to get to actually explore Narragansett Bay by sailing on the Oliver Hazard Ferry, which is our state tall ship. And they'll sail from Newport to Bristol to Providence and learn about African indigenous mariners at that time, and how they lived and how they interacted and what the ship was like. And it's all funded through this Birthright Rhode Island. And it's been privately funded, there's some federal funds, but more importantly, there's this real interest to give kids, all kids, a chance of experiential learning by seeing their history, but not from the negative lens of slavery, not from an owner class perspective, not sitting in class and learning about John Brown and Sally or James the Wolf. They're going to go see people that look like them, languages that represent their language, cultures and food and things that they can connect with. And we hope that inspires them to be great leaders of the future. So we're very excited about these two programs, the Portal, the Birthright program. They're cutting edge. You're not seeing it anywhere else in the country, but it's happening here in Rhode Island. And again, within the next 2 years, you'll start to see it more public, but we're giving you kind of an insight to that. So you can see I'm very passionate about this because my 4 kids are young adults. They've all come back to Rhode Island, and all 4 of them have said, we want every kid that looks like us to succeed in this state. There is no reason why young people, regardless of race, religion, or gender, shouldn't succeed in this state because of our history. But it starts by knowing the history. So again, thank you for this, and hopefully we'll come back and have you come to Newport.